You still doing Bullet Rye?
Yep.
Benny, what are you drinking? Japanese?
So this is I got a little bit too excited and carried away with myself. I went to Total Wine, which who knows where our listeners will be checking in from, but it's like Toys R Us for adults. And
yeah, isn't that like that huge like surplus booze store?
Oh my God, it's crazy. So they've got a whiskey aisle, which would make your eyes bleed. And like you can go and find an associate, and they've got like a little mini bar set up in the aisle so you can taste a couple of different things.
That reminds me of freaking Scotland, dude.
This one caught my eye. It's probably going to be hard to read the label, but it's Kaigan. And the label is really beautiful, and it's finished in Mizunara wood casks, which is like kind of like a good analogy would be like an oak tree, but it's like a specific Japanese species. And
sophisticated fuck.
Nice. It's very nice. It tastes great. But what I was going to say before is that I also had a bottle of Irish that the young lady that was helping me recommended. So maybe next episode I'll be drinking that instead.
Love it.
Yeah, stretching out my whiskey arms here. Okay. I suppose that's as good a time as any for us to jump in. And so one thing that I've been thinking about is usually when we go to do introductions or outros, I think the order has either been me first or me last. But then, Johnny, you usually kick it to Steve. But I think on all of our social medias and everything, the name order is Ben, John, Steve. So if it's cool with you guys, why don't we just have that be the order?
That's fine. That makes it easy.
Yeah, just so we know. Cheers, men. I think we all have whiskey tonight, so we can.
We do.
Very good. What are you drinking that out of, Johnny? A mason jar?
Mm-hmm. That's how we do it in Lebanon.
We'll get on the same page eventually with this whiskey thing. So, thanks for joining me. As usual, guys, I know that all of our lives are busy, but it's great that we can.
You guys.
Yeah, so I was telling Johnny that I texted Marlene yesterday to wish her a happy birthday. So happy birthday, Marlene. And she said she's so happy that we get to have these conversations and just like have fun and bang around a little bit now. So that was really sweet.
Yeah.
Well,
that's good. It's a big one, big 4-0.
Wife seal of approval. Yeah, it sounds like she's got a bunch of great plans to celebrate.
Yeah. The nice thing is Haley's birthday is right near her, so they can kind of like commingle them. And so, like, for example, they're going to Discovery Cove. I don't know if you know this, like outside of Orlando.
Yeah, she was telling me that they're going to do like a dolphin swim. And I was like, I would want to do that. Why don't you get to go?
Yeah, right.
You and Jack don't get to go to that, huh?
Nah, we'll do other stuff.
Would Jack have the attention span to do that? No,
he does not.
Are you guys just going to stand on a pier in the Intracoastal River and just take pot shots at dolphins, maybe?
Could do that in manatees.
The manatees are slow. That's like lower point value.
Did you guys ever see the video where one came up and hugged me?
No.
A manatee?
Whenever you guys come down, I got to show you that video. We were hanging out on the back of a boat, and a manatee just came up. It wouldn't leave me alone. This thing just like, it kept grabbing me and like hugging me, holding on. I was terrified when we were leaving that we were going to chop it up in the propeller.
It thought you looked like its wife, probably.
Yeah, probably.
All right, enough of that. I'm not trying to destroy you tonight. I'm trying to destroy Howie. So I'm sorry. Let me lay off a little bit.
I'm just getting you warm.
Thanks, buddy. Yeah. So my name is Ben, and I will just remind our audience to go fact yourselves. And who do I have with me today?
How you say that, Flapjack? It's John over here in the backwoods of Lebanon.
There you go.
And we got Steve reporting from Free State, Florida.
Free State of Florida correspondent Steve Glynn checking in. Very good. To remind everybody that may be watching or listening, this is the OSAS podcast, or of Straw and Steel, if you're not into the whole brevity thing, as we say sometimes. And this is exciting because we actually now have in the can an official debate episode. So we did our first round debate, which was last time. It wasn't exactly a week ago. We're still trying to find our sweet spot for scheduling, I think. But we actually have a proof of concept now. The episode, I think, worked tangentially. Like, it could be said to have worked. We could make that argument. And it was fun. I thought it was a really great time. We had a good conversation. We sort of were able to talk about some other tangential things, and it was just really enjoyable, I think. How did you guys feel?
Totally agree. Yeah, no, it was great. I got a little tipsy, had a little fun, a little debating from the other side on my part. It was interesting. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I just thought it was fun to kind of like see this idea that we've had, for a little bit kind of actually play itself out, rough around the edges and all. But I had fun, but I just trying to kind of feel it out and kind of see where we're going to hit our stride with some of this in terms of like structure and everything like that. But it was fun to see something that we came up with together and ended up actually committing to and putting out and recording, even if it's us that are the only ones that watch it. I think it was fun.
Yeah, for sure. And on that note, and since you were our last round's moderator, Johnny, okay, so just
Do we need an
to
official
open up
ruling?
exactly,
Or
you
are we going to
anticipated
put
me.
this in the can for maybe when we get some people to vote on these that will defer to the audience?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because we could sort of do it retrospectively, but if we, if we did do that, like functionally, it would be an evergreen judgment, right? Like if all of a sudden, Steve, thanks to you for teaching us what brigading means, but if we had somebody like gin up a bunch of brigading, they could all storm into the feedback. That's probably at this point basically strictly email. So you can email us at ofstrawandsteel@gmail.com. And if they just brigaded like a review one way or the other, like at any time, the decision could change if we did it that way, which is kind of
It's mob
interesting.
rule, dude. That's what happens.
That's right.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting too because sentiments about these questions in the populace will change over time. So I kind of like that idea.
So here we
But
are. Are we deferring to the audience members that will come in due time, or am I making an official ruling here?
what do you think, Steve? I'm kind of curious to see what Johnny has to say.
Oh, I was going to defer.
Okay, let's
No,
defer.
Johnny,
Let's
Yeah.
defer then.
recommend.
Let's defer. So we did have the debate about healthcare is a human right. This is the nostrum that was selected. We've got our randomized spinning wheel, which as of today has 19 topics, including the dealer's choice slide loaded into it. So the sweet spot, I think, is going to be hanging around 20. We're going to need to start replenishing. So hopefully that's another place where we can get some listener participation. We're trying to think of topics that we can put into the randomized selector. So anybody out there that's listening to this that enjoyed our first debate, who hopefully makes it through today's debate, can write to us at ofstrawandsteel@gmail.com and let us know if you've got some debate topics you want to suggest. One thing, as part of the round down that we're doing, where we go back and revisit the last episode, the last round, and we talk about some of the subjects we covered, there were a couple of things that I wanted to go back and touch on. And I found it so interesting because in the course of editing the round and uploading it, and like I watched it probably 4 times cover to cover, and I kept being so surprised by the fact that Steve, you and Johnny somehow had the same sort of argumentation about this whole like, does healthcare exist in nature? And I was so surprised to find you both arguing from that position. And so I was just curious, was that just like an artifact of the debate that we were having? Steve, is that something that you genuinely came to believe or believed before? Johnny, explain yourself. I'm very curious to hear about this.
Oh, no, we were conspiring behind the scenes.
That
Shadow
checks out.
government.
No, that was just sort of a natural conclusion that I drew.
I didn't even think about it until Steve actually brought it up, and I was thinking to myself, like, that there is healthcare in whatever primitive form it may be in nature that we as a civilization have figured out and has allowed us to perpetuate the species on down through the generations. So no, I thought that was an interesting point that Steve made, and I was just kind of flushing it out of my mind and talking about it while you guys were debating. So I thought it was just interesting that I think that thinking about it logically, there is some kind of healthcare in nature.
It's interesting because I still think you guys are a couple of kapusta heads for saying this argumentation, but that's really cool because part of the conceit of this show is I think we're going to discover things that we didn't even realize we believed, and that we'll find sort of ways that we think about the world differently, even though we know each other all really well. There'll be some things that come up and sort of surprise us a bit, which I think is really fun.
Agreed.
Yeah, so that was one thing I wanted to say. And then, the other thing, Steve, having been the guy that went in and embodied the left or the progressive position, to assert that healthcare is a human right. As we touched on last episode, you did it in a way that I wasn't really expecting, which was fun. It definitely kept me on my toes. But I was wondering if you had thought any more about, the fact that typically anybody that comes at this argument from the progressive position is typically trying to push, as you observed in our last round, for like straight away for universal healthcare. Mm-hmm. And so, do you have any thoughts, either of you guys? I'd be curious to hear your input too, Johnny, about this sort of like extraordinary knee-jerk reaction to just suggest this blanket thing, which exists in a lot of countries and has no uniformity to it whatsoever in all the places that it's instantiated. Just trying to offer this as like an extremely simple answer to a super complex question.
Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of thoughts on that. Human nature, I think, plays a huge role in that. Everybody wants a simple answer, right? We want a simple answer on Ukraine and Russia. We want a simple answer on healthcare. We want a simple answer on voter ID, for example. And it's most of the stuff, particularly healthcare, is extremely complex. I mean, it would take years. I don't think the three of us combined are smart enough to figure it out, right? Particularly not in one podcast. In fact, an entire country of people is not smart enough to figure it out.
Well, in fairness, I'm dragging the net intelligence on this three-way conversation down significantly. So if I were to bail,
I think we all feel that way. Yeah.
You guys might actually do all right by yourselves, I think.
I don't know who you're talking to, but I think it's all
particularly in a country of 340 million people. There's no one blanket argument that suits everybody.
That's another thing that
complex.
Yeah, I mean, that's another, the demographics in the difference between a country like the United States and the Scandinavian countries, where
culture and stuff like that too.
Culture, homogeneity of beliefs, of, right. even genetic variability and different types of inherited diseases and things, all of this.
Big time.
I mean, just makes such a big difference. And it's, there are countries where it's definitely easy to say, oh, okay, you guys were able to make this sort of united or universal healthcare system work. I can see kind of how you did that, but it's a little different here in the States.
Well, yeah, they always point to Scandinavia, you know what I mean? They all that because it's a small, homogeneous population, and a lot of their military budget and stuff like that's funded through our country, so they're not even having to bear the full brunt of the cost of what it takes to actually truly have free healthcare, as it were.
Yeah,
right. And of course, because money is fungible.
Let's see how great their universal healthcare is when we pull out of NATO.
No,
this never even occurred to me. But because money is fungible, like this just hit me in this moment. Like, we're not funding our own universal healthcare, but we are funding for those countries. So we're doing socialized medicine for a bunch of other people, but not ourselves.
Yeah,
that sounds terrible.
Yeah, I mean, they're constantly comparing us to Sweden or Denmark. I mean, those countries have populations roughly the size of Atlanta.
Yeah.
So and it's 99% homogenous. So
right, you're essentially doing it on a small scale, which I think is possible, but not to the scale that we're trying to do here in the United States with the population and diversity of the population.
But the population in Sweden is definitely much better looking than the population of Atlanta, I would say.
Right now,
objectively speaking,
we won't know in 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the only last thing, I think that's a good little roundup on, or round down. I'm getting my segments confused. I think that's a good little round down on some of the conversations that we were having the last time. There was one other thing I wanted to touch on, but I'll leave that to the end when we're doing our outro bits. We are we're coming up on the 20-minute marker. That's a little bit longer than we would usually have set aside based on the outline for the intro and round down. But, some of this will get cut. I'll figure out the best place for us to come in. So I think that'll work out. And, frankly, Steve, our moderator for the night, if you want to, we can move into the debate section and you can let us know what the topic is, who's on what side of it, and we can jump in.
Very good. Yes, I'm going to be the moderator, and it is my sole responsibility to stay the hell out of the way and maybe ask a couple questions. So on the left side of the issue, we have, go ahead.
I'm debating that voter ID is racist.
And on the right side?
So on the right side, essentially attacking that statement is me, Ben, the most cancelable man on the podcast because I keep drawing the right position.
And with that, your
I don't know,
opening
man.
statement.
Even taking the right position, Steve might have you beat.
Yeah, that's
rigged,
true.
bro.
True. That's true.
Let's get right into it. You think?
I think we could just jump right in if you're ready to make your statement, Johnny.
Yeah, honestly, I didn't have anything prepared for an opening statement. It's not going to be very long. I'm just going to be supplying evidence that voter ID is racist based off of some historical precedents that were set, some socioeconomic issues, some constitutional issues, and then going into some just kind of fact-based studies and things like that with some statistics and some data analysis to prove that voter ID is racist.
Very good. And Ben?
As usual, I've got a way too long prepared opening statement, so I'm going to try and read this fast so that we don't all get bored to tears.
Please.
Thank you. Here I go. There have been many things in life that could be fairly claimed to be racist, acts or policies on both individual or institutional levels that have intentionally and sometimes even unintentionally negatively impacted certain races of people. In the 1800s, Chinese immigrants that worked in conditions we might today recognize as slave labor were further victimized by the Chinese Exclusion Act. Hibernophobia, a term with which Johnny is probably very familiar, used to encompass general bigotry against the people of Ireland, has been widely practiced across countries and cultures, but is most recently recognized in industrializing North America under the ubiquitous signage, Irish need not apply. And of course, perhaps the most notorious and well-known cases in our American zeitgeist would surely be the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, close on its wake, largely lasting to, and in some cases even through, the Civil Rights era. There are only these scantling examples that I could fit into my statement of the many possible instances of racism that characterize the experience of being human, much as we grapple with its chains. And in light of these examples, which witness true and naked discrimination based on ethnicity of an entire people, discrimination which contains social ostracism, different legal standards of treatment, and even self-justified violence, the claim that voter ID is racist must necessarily lift a very heavy burden. Packed into this widely used nostrum is a veritable magician's trunk of cheap ideas and the slogans that they spawn. To grant this claim any legitimacy, there are several unwieldy assumptions that must be granted a priori. First, that there is something fundamentally discriminatory about asking one race to show ID versus another when both are being asked to show ID. On its face, this is a farce. If anything, it's an exercise in radical equality. Second, that there is something about the system of government ID procurement generally that is inaccessible to one race versus another, based somehow on the inherent characteristics of that race. I'll leave it to my friend John to explore this philosophical wilderness if he so chooses. I would be remiss too if I neglected to point out. Sorry, what?
I said, what was that last part you cut out for a second?
Oh, I see. Is this legal, moderator? Can I repeat my opening statement to his benefit?
I'll allow it.
So to recap that part, I said you have to prove or assume that there is something about the system of government ID procurement generally that is inaccessible to one race versus another based somehow on the inherent characteristics of that race. And then I said, I'll leave it to my friend John to explore this philosophical wilderness if he so chooses.
All right, so...
Buddy, I'm only about halfway done, pal.
Holy shit.
Yeah, slow your roll, bro. Slow your roll.
Jesus.
I know you're chomping at the bit here. I get it.
I warned you. I would be remiss too.
Like you. Sorry.
What's that?
I said I was once like you.
I would be remiss too if I neglected to point out that the assumption of intentional disenfranchisement, specific to the sacred civil liberty of voting, which is wrapped up in this claim, suggests that there is a spider web of red string on a corkboard in some smoky room by which the incredible leap of reason has been made that A, race X wants to vote, B, race X should be prevented from voting, C, race X might be prevented from voting by requiring that they provide their ID, D, despite huge ranges of variability of living standards, they can be readily relied upon not to procure the ID. E, that such measures, despite the mixing of populations of races X and Y in either rural or urban considerations, will only impact race X, or that it's not important that race Y is similarly impacted. And F, that the infrastructure exists to enact and maintain such a sprawling conspiracy. To draw a line between these points and take oneself seriously is a feat of logical flexibility to make the head swim. Perhaps, Johnny, I can interest you in the theory that Hillary Clinton is a lizard person? There is also, of course, the condescending and paternalistic implication that the groups meant to be spoken for by the Nostrum are, quote unquote, babes in the woods, unable to perform a task as simple as procuring standard government ID. Indeed, a ritual of citizenship that the U.S. Department of Transportation estimates might represent as many as 225.5 million U.S. citizens in 2023. After all, what is it about a black person per se, or a Hispanic, or an Armenian, or any ethnic personage to which this claim might be applied that makes them unable to procure even basic government documentation? Is it their skin color, the quality and texture of their hair, genetic tendencies to sickle cell anemia, or lower percentiles of mature height, or the set of their eyes and their face? No. Of course, it's none of these things listed or any other of the countless immutable characteristics that make different races of people, indeed, as different as two siblings can be if the scope of focus is sufficiently fine. Let us speak plainly then. The assumption of this core claim is that, quote unquote, black and brown people are not as competent to take the steps required to obtain government-issued identification as white or other, quote unquote, majority races. I refute this claim unequivocally. Voter ID isn't racist. The claim itself is racist and dehumanizing and toxic to our polity.
Thank you, Mr.
I'm underpaid.
All right. Well, let's kick this off by defining racism. And as you
Very easy. Okay, great. Can I use the Ibram X. Kendi racism is a thing that's racist definition?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, great. Done.
Whatever supports your argument.
Like,
and to your procurement example, how does racism affect procurement of voter ID?
This is a question for me.
For both of you.
All right, so we got to define racism first.
Yeah. What do you guys mean by racism?
Who's going
Anyone.
first? I mean, honestly, if I was to do this to help my argument out here, I would say that it's, discrimination. What did you say? Power plus prejudice equals racism. So you have to have like institutional power and, like a discriminatory attitude towards like a prejudice against somebody. But I would say that it's just the hatred of somebody based off of their skin color. That's one thing. If you just really define it deep down as a hatred based off of skin color.
I'm happy to agree to that definition for the purposes of this argument. I think functionally racism can be such a broad term that it could be applied to almost any recognition of difference between races. But for the purposes of this argument, I think Johnny's done a fine job. Intentional discrimination to the negative effect on the discriminated based on race. Now, the procurement question you asked, Steve, was that?
Yeah. How is that, in your view, how is that affected by racism as you define it?
Well, this is the claim for you to make, Johnny, so I'll leave you to that.
I kind of didn't want to get into this part of the debate right now. I had some stuff I wanted to define out here.
Well, sure.
So that kind of got to like where I was trying to get to a little bit later. I guess,
buddy, you can tell the moderator to go fuck. It's fine.
No, I want to answer the question, but I kind of wanted to I wanted to ask you a question, Ben, if I could.
Please.
What's the point of voter ID? Why do we do it?
So for the sake of this conversation, because it is not something that's implemented federally and uniformly to require voter ID to vote. Johnny, we both live in Connecticut, so I'm sure when you go to your polling station, you get asked to show your license, as I do. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, that may not be the case in other places. And so the idea, and I think this has been fomenting for quite some time, but certainly within the last 10 years, it's gotten more fevered. The idea would be that by showing your ID, you're proving eligibility to vote by being a citizen that has legally issued government identification. And that would also, include demonstrating that you live in the district to which you've reported to the polling station, et cetera.
Okay. I mean, so what would you consider fraud in terms of like showing how would we determine that it's a fraudulent thing if we have if we don't have the ID in front of us? Like I guess what I'm saying is, so I would define having voter ID is that you are who you say you are.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we agree on that?
I think that's fine for this. Yeah.
All right. So my point is that in-person voter ID fraud happens at such a low rate that in 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, over 250 million votes being cast, although only 193 criminal offenses were actually convicted as a result of trying to impersonate somebody else. It's actually the least likely type of fraud to happen. You're actually much more likely to have fraud with like mail-in ballot voting and stuff like that. But in-person voting, it's the lowest form of fraud. So if the
Yep.
whole purpose is to protect the integrity of the elections and to say that we are who we say we are, why is it that when we institute those things, it does such a very poor job in terms of catching criminals that are impersonating people that want to like vote illegally?
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to cut you off. So if you had anything
No,
else, I'm
that's
happy
it.
to. That's it. Okay. Yeah. So admittedly, instances of people providing false identification in order to try and vote to manipulate or commit fraud in the voting system are very, very rare. But to say that they're rare and to say that it never happens are two different things. Of course, I think we could both agree. I think we could also agree that rare though it may be, it should never be happening. And finally, rare though it may be, it's not racist to require voter ID just because it's rare. So if that's the line of argumentation, or if that's the reasoning that's trying to be used here.
I'm getting to that. I wanted to address first, like, what's the purpose of having ID in the first place?
Okay.
If it's to say who we say we are, and it's to cut down on voter fraud and to have election integrity and everything like that, there's much better ways to do that than it is to use an identification to present it when you're either registering or you're in-person voting.
To that, I would say that I think it's farcical to have this assumption or this expectation that we shouldn't need to provide ID in the first place. We have to provide ID for something as simple as going and buying a pack of cigarettes or a lottery ticket. So certainly the most sacred of our democratic rights as a country, as a nation, should be
Agreed.
something that's as protected as the right to go and buy a bottle of liquor by having to provide your ID for it.
Right. But what I'm saying is that voting is a constitutional right, is it not?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so if we have a constitutional right and then there's people that don't have the money to exercise that, where does that stand in terms of like how you feel about that? If somebody's like, if you have a voting block that's historically disenfranchised, low income, things like that, that don't have the capacity to get the identification necessary to exercise their right to vote, you don't think that's discriminatory?
I may not understand the investment required to get even basic government ID. I believe that there are forms of ID that are cost free, but maybe you can educate me there.
No. So the four forms of ID recognized by the government to vote in an election is a driver's license, passport, a military ID if applicable, and then a state issued ID, all of which cost money.
How much?
So I'm going to get to that. Are you familiar? Like, do you have any idea of like the percentage of people across the United States that do not actually have the required ID?
Well, so in the U.S. Department of Transportation survey that I cited in my opening statement, they estimated in 2023 that up to 225.5 million people have some sort of government issued ID. Now, it did not go on to specify what types of ID that included. I would say that if those IDs that they do have, if that number is true, and again, it's a government reported statistic, so I'll believe it, I guess, for the sake of this argument, even if that statistic does not account for quote unquote acceptable forms of ID, the four that you just laid out, if we were to make government issued ID a mandate for all voting, they could certainly choose to accept one or another as long as it was included in that report.
I don't disagree with that, but we're not issuing free government IDs to everybody to make sure that they have the ability to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So like I said, The four forms of ID that we accept at the polls is driver's license, passport, military ID if applicable, and state issued ID. So I'm going to go over and give you a little statistics right here. So 18% of people over 65, which is actually 6 million people, don't have driver's license, 25% of those being minorities from a 2022 study, 16% Latino, 25% of African Americans, which is 5 million people, 15% of people that make less than $35,000. And then that's all from the 2020 national election study right there. And then a statistic I found kind of interesting here is that 13.8% of African Americans don't have a checking or savings account. So how are they supposed to supply money for documentation to get the ID if they don't even have a checking or savings account?
Well, I think you're making a voter ID as classist argument rather than a voter ID as racist argument.
Well, I'm going to get to some of that other stuff there too. But if you look at an overwhelming majority of the people that don't have the IDs happen to be ethnic minorities.
Well, you also did say that there was a wealth cutoff, which
there's 100%
I could have missed.
A wealth cutoff.
Well, what I was going to say is I may have missed it, but I don't think that there was any racial valence through which that statistic came. And so what I would say is that, a black person is no more likely to be poor than any other average or random person you could pluck from our polity. And so, certainly I could understand if you're saying that people can't afford to get a form of ID, which, I think you said you're going to talk about the cost, but I would be very hard pressed to think that it's unaffordable to get a form of ID for almost
That's
anybody.
what I said, and I think that you'd be interested to see how extreme some of them can be.
Can't wait for it, but can't wait to hear it. I am interested, but again, that's a wealth argument. That's a voter ID is discriminatory against poor people rather than racist.
Are overwhelmingly ethnic minorities the higher percentage of people that don't have IDs and that are have less money?
There are literally infinite factors that could explain that. It could be a system of cultural values that don't prioritize getting ID. It could simply be as easy as saying, hey, I'm not required to get ID to vote, so I haven't gotten an ID.
Yeah, well, it sounds to me, if I can just jump in here, it sounds like on a per capita basis, he's right. And perhaps the laws aren't explicitly racist, but maybe that's.
Well, here's what I'm going to say is that we have historic laws with Jim Crow laws that apply to African American population. I mean, historically, we instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, violence, and intimidation. I would actually postulate that photo ID is the modern day poll tax, that you need to pay something out of pocket to be able to cast your constitutional vote right there.
Well, sure, but if everybody has to pay the same quote unquote modern day poll tax, then it's not racist.
But if they're historically disenfranchised and don't have the wealth accumulation that other ethnic minorities do that may be more well off, how can you say that it has nothing to do with that? There's historical racism factored into where they are in terms of financial status as a culture.
Maybe this would be the opportunity for you to tell us about some of the costs that you've mentioned.
All right. A couple other things I wanted to talk about before I get into that is
you're savage.
No, I plan on answering everything. I just had this written out in a way that I kind of I wanted to get all my points across right here, and then we can debate everything line by line if you want to do it. All right. So if you take a study in 2021, only 11% of eligible voters, or it says 11% of eligible voters in the entire country, they lack the ID for the strictest form of ID law. So they do have identification, but they don't have the IDs required to vote for forms of ID that I'd said previously. Another type of another base right here that's affected by it is college students. 2022, 42.5% of all college students were of color. So the state's not recognizing or they're not recognizing student IDs as an acceptable form of ID, affects students who are historically lower income. And I know you're going to say that I'm making a classist argument right there, but if half the kids from college are ethnic minorities, then I would say that that's an issue there as well. That,
if I may interrupt, what I'm actually going to say to that is that students, especially through college, shouldn't be eligible to vote, period. So that's actually, we could set that aside.
All right, that's a completely different argument, though. If they're eligible to vote, then they're eligible to vote. I don't disagree with you, but I'm just saying that's not relevant.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's not a classist concern for me. It's a you're too stupid to be voting concern. Anyway,
so then we get.
I'm trying to unbalance you a little, Johnny. I'm trying to unbalance and get underneath your statistics spewing for a minute.
No, it's fine. It's fine. And then so we get into to be able to get one of those four forms of IDs. you typically need other IDs, right? So you're getting into this circular or cyclical issue where I need to get my driver's license, but in order for me to get my driver's license, I had to provide a birth certificate or something like that. So what about Native Americans, right, that are born typically on native land? They're born at home. They don't have birth certificates. U.S. officials typically do not accept the Native Americans' own internal IDs that they use to recognize one another. The U.S. officials do not recognize that. And then a lot of them, they're the second highest homeless population in the United States, lack a permanent address, which does not allow them to be able to get a license right there. So they're not able to get a vote. So we talk about that's, again, you have historical discrimination and racism against Native American population right there. We have instances, again, where they don't have the birth certificate necessary to be able to go get a driver's license, to be able to go vote. So I would say that the law right there is racist in that regard because of historical racism right there. And you have, this, like I said, extreme homelessness, right? And there's reasons why they're homeless. I mean, we can get into, reservations and all that kind of stuff right there. And, how we've kicked them off their land and all that. And then another statistic I wanted to bring up was 37% of the homeless population is actually Black with, again, no permanent address, no ability to get an ID.
37%?
37% of the homeless population is Black men.
So the argument is that voter ID requirements.
They can't get the ID because they don't have a permanent address.
Well, sure, yeah, fair enough. But the only point I was going to make is that for the and I'm sorry, you're giving me so many numbers. 37%, is that what you said?
37% of the homeless population is Black men.
Just trying to sharpen the number. So that means that the remaining 63% are not Black, and so I'm having trouble understanding how you saying that homelessness is a racist reason that voter ID is racist.
Well, if you take into account that Native Americans are the second highest homeless population right there, that's two ethnic minorities with historical racism and discrimination having a homeless issue, having issues being able to get the necessary documents to be able to get a driver's license or a government issued ID. So I would think that if you have an extremely high percentage of two ethnic minorities with historical discrimination, I would say that the laws in and of themselves are racist as a result of that because it's keeping them from being able to get the necessary documents they need to be able to exercise.
So if your statistics are to be relied on, and I'll take it at its word that they are, 37 is the Black population of homelessness.
Yeah.
The Native American homeless population is lower than that, which means a plurality of homeless, more than either of those two populations, are non-Black and non-Native American. So again, I think it's a stretch to say that's racist.
If you take those and you take the single race out of it, you're not going to have a higher percentage than you have of Native Americans and African Americans. Yeah, you can say all.
Okay, well, take those two populations out, and then.
But yeah. I'm telling you right now, if you take that 37%, I didn't get the percentage for Native Americans, but it is the second highest homeless population. So you're looking at over half the population is those two races right there. Again, I'm going to just rely on the historical discrimination and racism.
Yeah, okay, but if we're just taking out statistical populations, then let's remove the Black and Native American populations you just referenced, and now all the white people are the homeless ones. So
it's not just
I'm not sure that's a compelling
Asian,
argument.
It's Latino. There's other races in there that you have to factor in. It's not just white people.
Right, but it is also white people, and so I'm just not convinced that.
The point I'm trying to make, if you take those two populations right there, they're more than half of the population. So yes, two of those are an overwhelming majority. So, right, isn't it a majority 51% right there? So if it's over 50%, then that's going to be a majority of homelessness is those two populations right there.
Okay, I would say that's a neat little statistical sleight of hand where you're combining two disparate races to create like an uber race that helps you justify the argument you're making. But
it's racist. It doesn't have to be racist against one culture right there to be considered racist, right? We're using historical data. We're using historical facts of discrimination against these two populations right here. And I'm saying that discrimination has perpetuated itself into an ability for some of these races to not have the means to be able to afford the documents that they need to go. So I'm going to kind of, if we want to get back to this, I will, but I wanted to get into some poverty stats here as well, if that's all right with you.
This is really, I'm trying not to be the moderator, but I think at some point you have to answer the question of what are the costs of these IDs?
What's that?
You have to answer the question of what are the costs.
That's where I'm getting right now. That's where I'm getting right now. So do you know that between 25 and 30% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck?
President.
A quarter or a third of the country is living paycheck to paycheck, right? So what we might consider as a minuscule dollar amount, other people aren't able to afford these things that we would consider minuscule. So if you look at the poverty stats, all right, 17.9% African American, 17% Latino, 23% Native American, only 7.7% white, 8.1% Asian. All right, so driver's license on average across the United States is $89. All right, but I'm looking at a pretty wild stat here that between $20 and $1,000 in certain places to get an ID. That's not a minuscule amount of money. Even $89, I can tell you, for when I didn't have a lot of money and I was living paycheck to paycheck, $89 was out of the question for me able to do that. I had just enough money to be able to afford food for the week, and then I was literally eating out of a garden at work. I could not afford $89 to get a license. Birth certificate, $50. If you get into name changes, so we're getting into like just different things. This isn't for my argument here, but I'm giving you an idea of what it costs to change certain things on your documents here. $500 for a name change, and that's initial and then maintenance right there. So getting your ID renewed after a certain period of time. So there is, I don't have the statistic for me in front of me, but I do know that there is a significant issue with birth certificates actually being filled out improperly that need to be changed right there. So if you're changing your name on there, some of the information on there for your birth certificate, that costs money. That costs money just to get the birth certificate. And then you got to buy the birth certificate. And then with the birth certificate, then you can take that and you can go and buy a driver's license with it, or you can get a passport with it. So it's not just a minuscule amount of money. So if you have disenfranchised populations that are in poverty, that don't have the money to afford it, historically disenfranchised, I would say that having all these laws as barriers for them to be able to get these IDs is in a sense racist. If we want to talk about the government giving IDs to all populations right there so they're eligible to exercise their constitutional right, I mean, that would be a different thing, but this is what it is. These are barriers for ethnic minority populations from being able to get the necessary identification. So
all right, so let me ask you
commonplace.
If I can step in. So provided that the government was to provide easy to obtain and free IDs, would that alleviate your concerns about racism, or are there deeper issues, you think?
No, I think that if we were able to provide these populations that are in poverty and, again, historic discrimination in there, then I think that would be something that would be to alleviate the issue for people to have they wouldn't have barriers to get to the identification that they need to be able to vote.
What do you think, Ben?
So should I attack that? I'm not sure if that was a question just meant for Johnny, or if I should just jump in with something different.
Oh, you got a lot to respond to, bro. Just go for it.
Yeah. So, Johnny, I'm curious. There's a lot of different angles from which you're making this argument, and so one of the ones that you seem to be coming back to is the historical intentional disadvantagement of certain populations.
Yep.
So I think probably everybody on this conversation right now will grant that is certainly a very unfortunate blemish on, the history of American politics and culture. And so now in 2025, I would ask you, do you believe that we're beyond that? And if not, do you think it's intentional that these disadvantagements are still occurring?
Can you repeat the question one more time? I forgot the first part of it.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just saying, I think we all agree, Jim Crow was a real thing.
Yeah. What was the question?
So the question is, and this may not be a fair question to ask. This might be like one of those, I'm going to do meta for a second and go outside the debate and say, we're asking you and you're doing an absolute smash up job, making this case, I think. But at the end of the day, I know that you're inhabiting this idea and this argument in a way that may or may not be authentic to what you truly believe. And so maybe it's not appropriate for me to ask you beyond this conversation, do you actually think, right? Because like, how much am I? This is one of the things about this format that we're trying to do. It's like, how totally are we going to have to inhabit these ideas as people that are advocating for them? So maybe this will be a good first test case, maybe. Okay, so what I was going to ask you is, do you think that systemic discrimination from the past, Jim Crow, for example, is being intentionally carried forward into the present day so that voter ID being a requirement for voting, government issued ID, is that being used to intentionally disenfranchise a
But
voting population?
does intentionality have to be there if those are laws that are on the books and
No,
stuff like that?
no, I don't think it does. I'm
They're
just curious.
intentionally doing that, but I think that at some point, right here, is like these cultures that, like I said, that you look at them. So African Americans and Native Americans are like the highest poverty ethnic minorities right there, and I don't know if it's them having an issue playing catch up. You would mention something too about like culture and like home life. It's a very complex argument, but I think that, again, I think some of these historical barriers that are still in place, whether they're intentional or not, are racist in effect because they're not allowing people who are clearly disadvantaged right now and disadvantaged because of history from being able to vote properly, have the IDs that they need to vote.
Yeah, there's so much that I'm not even really sure how to proceed. But I guess what I would say is that, first of all, what on earth costs $1,000 to get as a government issued ID?
I also have that question.
Places that don't want to, they want to prioritize public transportation, so they're going to make fees. Like, Steve, how many different gun laws are they when they say that they want to outlaw something, and then they're like, all right, well, we're going to keep it on the books, but now you got to pay an astronomical fee every 2 years to keep it, so it prevents people from doing it because it's a monetary.
Wouldn't know I'm in Florida.
What's that?
I wouldn't know I'm in Florida.
All right.
No, I mean, so you're right. I mean, they particularly with gun laws, they don't just ban them outright, right? Like they'll have a tax on bullets or something like this, so it just makes it unaffordable to the average person. You're not wrong on that.
Well, that's what I was saying with the license right there. It's they're trying to incentivize public transportation, and they're trying to disincentivize personal transportation right there. So they make the fees on these IDs and stuff like that astronomical. Is that the norm? No. But I wanted to put that in there to show you there's an extreme. $20 to $1,000. That's a pretty big gap. Again, so nationally, sure. $89. To me, that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but there's times in my life where $89 was a lot of money.
Yeah, but there are also non-driver's license government IDs that are functionally similar in every way to a driver's license, except that you can't use it to legally operate a motor vehicle.
Right. And that would be a state-issued ID. Again, all of those things cost money. Those aren't just handed out to you.
I mean, I could very easily make the argument that Elon Musk is way more capable of paying for a driver's license than I am. So I just feel like, the sliding... No, it's very relevant because you've set up this sliding scale of somewhat arbitrary affordability, depending very neatly sort of parsed off to account for like a racist consideration here. But even though we're both white, Elon's a lot richer than I am. So isn't he more advantaged at getting government issued ID than I am?
I mean, that's bringing it back to a wealth argument then.
Yeah, exactly.
The point I'm trying to make is that you're looking at poverty, right? So I was trying to say that the two cultures with historic discrimination have also the highest level of poverty right there. So with higher levels of poverty becomes less affordability, right? So I think those are barriers for those people, and whether or not those are intentional right now is I don't know. I don't think it's intentional, but it's still something from another time period that's still in the way, preventing them from being able to vote and get the IDs.
So just to reiterate, please let me know if I'm not accurately sort of reiterating what you were saying before, but I think you're saying that voter ID being required for, I keep saying voter ID being required for voting. That's redundant. So government issued ID being required for voting, that would be a systematic or systemic sort of racial obstacle put up for a certain like specified set of people who experience more poverty and are less able, according to your argumentation, to get that ID. And that's all contained within this like institution of our government. And if it were instantiated federally, that would be racist.
I don't know. I think that you kind of combined a lot of different things in there that I didn't say.
Did I? You threw so much shit at me, buddy. I'm trying my best here.
No, all right.
I'm not trying to misrepresent what you said.
I guess I don't know how to answer your question right now, other than saying that there's historical barriers that are still in place, whether intentional or not. They're still there, and they affect ethnic minority populations, prevent them from being able to get the necessary ID.
Yeah, I just, maybe, Steve, I don't want to do your job as moderator, but it feels like maybe we're getting to an impasse here. And
I have a ton of other stuff here I wanted to get to.
No. We're good.
No, for real though. Like I have something here in. I need to read the 14th Amendment here. All right.
I don't think you do.
I do, because this is integral in talking about what we're talking about here. So under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, states are not allowed to pass laws unduly burdening the right to vote. Lynn Adelman, a U.S. District Judge, found precedent that the law could be invalidated if it places undue burden on a subgroups of citizens such as Latinos and African Americans. If the burdens placed on that population are not outweighed by the state's justification for the law that places that burdens on the voting subgroup, Supreme Court has ruled states cannot burden voters based on the prevention of dangers that are very likely and only possible in that protection. I would say that's burdening voters right there.
But that's a state judgment, right? We're talking about federal voter ID law.
If there's state issued IDs, that's the state issue right there. That's not federal.
But if the federal government comes down and says every state has to require voter ID to go to your polling place and vote, then that would be a federal dictate.
Yes, it would.
In other words, it would not be a state imposed requirement, which I think means that what you've just read would be inapplicable. But I'm also not a constitutional scholar.
Not every state is instituting voter ID, so you can't just say that it's all federal thing, because not all states are participating in it.
Right. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, if we were going to have government issued ID required for voting, it should be a federal blanket that applies to everybody uniformly. And I think I could be wrong, but that I think is the heart of the argument, that if you go to vote, no matter what state you live in, you should be required to show ID.
Well, all right. So, Ben, let me ask you this. Do you have any insights into the order of magnitude in voter fraud?
We covered this while you were chasing a small child around your house, you sick pervert.
It's actually 0.00004% in-person voting fraud right there.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay, so do you think there's clearly some number, it's not zero, of people that are disenfranchised, right? It's not zero. They're disenfranchised by having to obtain an ID. Is there evidence that that number would exceed the amount of voter fraud?
That the amount of people disenfranchised would, so in other words, the negative consequence of requiring voter ID would not be enough to justify it because of the fraud that would be saved by having the voter ID?
Exactly right.
That's an interesting question. I hate to go back to the old line, we're a nation of laws, but we are a nation of laws. And so whether it's one person or, 1,000 or 10,000 that are fraudulently using ID to impersonate being somebody else or vote in a district to which they shouldn't be allowed, or if it's an illegal immigrant using a fake ID to vote, or if it's somebody going in, not being asked to provide any ID and committing a fraudulent vote, each one of those is an affront to our democracy and the system that was set up for our nation to function correctly.
Right. So can I add something? Or are you done?
I'd like to finish, if I may, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
That's all right. Just fucking with you. So 100%, I agree and acknowledge absolutely it is a very, very diminishingly small percentage of in-person fraud that happens at polling places. However, each one of those is an illegal action. It could be prevented by requiring voter ID to be shown. And just because it's a small percentage does not mean that it's racist or not racist. There's no racial valence to that. It's just every citizen, white, black, green, yellow, must show voter ID to vote, period.
Okay, I'm not disputing that, right? I'm disputing that there's barriers for certain populations to be able to get the ID necessary to vote.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that people shouldn't have it, but I'm saying that if you're gonna make that case that everybody should have it, then it should be equally accessible to all populations. And right now it's not. And if I wanted to get into a couple statistics before I'm completely done with all of this shit, and we can talk about the rest of this, but Texas 2013, they issued voter ID. It affected 608,470 registered voters. Blocked about 4.5% of the registered voters being able to exercise their right. 2013 in Kansas affected 63,000 votes from being able to get registered. 2017 Georgia required exact match, meaning if their name was Jonathan and John was on their ID, it was null and void. That flagged about 51,000, 80% of which were African Americans and Latinos. There was a lawsuit that was overturned in Georgia in 2019 for that. But I'm just saying that like the idea is it's affecting a good majority of people's ability to be able to exercise their right to vote. And we're looking at these populations right here that are most affected by the ability to vote. And we're looking at, again, we're looking at Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, mostly African Americans and Native Americans.
So Johnny, your name is Jonathan Howard, but your driver's license theoretically could say Matt Howard. So you're white, but that would have been a law that would have affected you, and so I don't see any racial valence to that at all.
I'm just telling you that the statistics I gave you have no. I'm telling you, there were one of them. It said 80% of the 51,000 that were flagged for the exact match were ethnic minorities. But the other ones, I'm telling you that the voter ID instituting it right there did not allow a significant amount of the population to vote.
Okay, that I could agree with that if that's true, but that's not racist.
It's like I said, we go back to barriers being put up for certain populations that are not allowed to, that they're not allowed, but they don't have the necessary resources to get the IDs to vote. So requiring ID for them to be able to vote is basically, again, I'm telling you, like I said before, the photo ID is the modern day poll tax, and that you're putting taxes on people that can't afford to pay for them to be able to exercise their constitutional right. And that's racist.
I think it's a bit of a leap to say that they can't afford it. I'm not sure how you arrived at that conclusion.
We talked about the poverty stats.
That's fine. But I think everybody for their own person can decide if it's valuable to invest in a government issued ID if it allows them to vote. And so, I find it a little bit infantilizing for you to say sweepingly for broad populations, mostly based on race, according to your argument, that they cannot or would not choose to invest the couple of tens of dollars to get government issued ID if it meant they could express their voting intent.
All right, so we talk about people in poverty, right? People in poverty can't take as much time off because they don't get time off to get the ID. A lot of them don't have the necessary money to afford the travel expenses because a lot of people that are in rural areas and city areas have to travel a certain distance to be able to get it. What was the stat that I had here? In Wisconsin, right? Let's take Wisconsin right here. There's 92 DMV organizations in there, service centers in the entire state. Only one is open on the weekend, right? And two of those are open past 5, right? So
yeah, the DMV sucks. Everybody, yeah.
Right. So what I'm saying, though, is that if you have people in poverty, right, they can't take time off work to do it. They can't afford the travel expenses. And even when they do, there's the inability to access those. Again, we go back to which populations are the most disenfranchised, which ones are in the most in poverty, which ones are not able to afford the IDs. That's ultimately where I'm coming from. I don't have any other statistic, thank God, beyond that. But that's what I got. I don't really know how else to.
Sure. It sounds like I said, it sounds like on a per capita basis, you're not incorrect. So, I mean, lawmakers know this, even if they're not explicitly making these laws to be biased against certain races. I mean, is there a chance that it's not explicit?
Was that for me?
Ben?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, yeah. I mean, well, I think the burden of proof is for Johnny to say whether or not there's racism, implicit or explicit, in the system of requiring government issued ID for voting. And I think he's done a fine job of sort of laying out the case for that. But we are at an hour and 7 minutes at this point, and so I'm wondering if maybe we should try and do closing statements.
Yeah, let's go ahead. Ben, hit us with your closing.
I'm ready for my closing statements. Okay, ready, boys? So I'm just going to say, Johnny, you've made some really compelling arguments. But again, depending on your intent as the person arguing for the claim that voter ID is racist, you can sort of tack together, a very convenient framing to make it look that way. But at the end of the day, the entire argument boils down to one of affordability. Everything you said was related to the cost or the requirement of time or capital to procure government issued ID. And that's simply not a racist argument. For example, there are people in Appalachia who would have the same disadvantages that you cited as Native Americans or people of color in urban centers, for example, who would not have available capital or access to DMV locations, for example, that would have the exact same experience and difficulty in procuring some of these identification forms, who would also be disenfranchised. And although you could probably still somehow manage to jigsaw your way into saying that that's still racist because Black people are affected more, I find it very difficult to make the argument that it is something that is specifically racist against Black or brown people when it also disenfranchises an equally financially disadvantaged set of the population that happens to be white.
You done?
Matt, you're closing.
All right. I just wanted to make sure he was done. I kept cutting him off the entire fucking time. I just wanted to make sure.
No. You were good.
I basically, I'm going to stick to my guns here, and I'm going to tell you that, if there's laws on the books that are preventing a majority of the population from being able to have access to something, that I think that you could make a case that there is racial bias for it, especially if you look into the history of why these people are in poverty and why they are disenfranchised to begin with. I think if you look into that, then you'll notice that those are just a continuation of a lot of the racial disparities in railroads for them to be able to have the ability to exercise the ability to vote and to get IDs and have the financial ability to do that.
Very good. Let's wrap it up.
Oh, that was fucking hard.
Johnny, that was a tour de force. I feel like that's the bar set.
I had more stats too, but I was like getting off rails.
I must have started like 16 messages to both of you. Yeah, seriously. I must have started 16 messages over the last week to both of you guys where I'm like, dude, I was like, Howard, you got dealt a shit hand.
I really only had one fucking playbook, and Benny fucking called me out.
I was like, you guys want to respin? I had such you guys, by the way, blew up every single question I had. I mean, any question I had, you blew it. I had 8 of them, 4 for each of you, and you blew up 3 on both sides. So props to you. You guys did your research on this, and the thing about this one, I don't know if you guys found this, but you can find somebody's research that supports either side of the argument.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's the only way.
Yeah, that's why we're the ones that have to decide it with finality on this podcast.
Compelling, yeah.
What I found interesting is that, so I've mentioned before that I've got a contact on the inside, somebody who's very progressive that I like to bounce things off of, especially as we're developing ideas for this podcast or whatever it might be. And my contact on the inside was really surprised by the topic for today's round and said, like, hey, neither me nor any of my progressive friends really believe that voter ID is racist. And so I was like, okay, we've talked about this before, that some of the ideas that we've come up for our spinning wheel may not be really representative of a large progressive population. But I was just really surprised because I feel like, especially in the wake of the 2020 election and, to a lesser degree, this past election cycle, there's been so much talk about, voter fidelity and whether or not fraud was happening and things of that nature. And it seemed to me that there was a lot of chatter on the progressive side to say that, you know, any attempts to implement voter ID requirements would be racist. And so I was shocked to find that, you know, somebody that I rely on to get the progressive perspective just didn't feel that way at all.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I was under that impression the whole time.
Yeah,
We were in our own echo chamber here.
that exactly. Like this whole, you just want to scrap this episode? We could just completely write it off and forget everything Johnny just did, all the hard work and toil.
No, absolutely not.
I mean, whether or not we just did like a swing and a miss on something that's really politically and culturally relevant is
We're going to have
irrelevant.
plenty of those.
I think so too. I think we're going to have some, but
Especially as fast as the world is moving.
Even if it's not
exactly.
like an overwhelming position of like the progressive left, I think it's, you know, I think that the topics we came up with, I think it'd be fun to explore. Like I said, I mean, all of this stuff that I just regurgitated here, do I believe a lot of it? No, I don't. But I also, you know, like I got to see a different perspective I wouldn't have done if I didn't like get in there and dig in the research.
Yeah.
I think that's cool. And I think that, you know, 19 more topics is it's a chance for us to kind of explore some different things and, you know, talk it out, hash it out, learn about some stuff and, you know, just see what it is. I think that's fun.
Yeah, I'm just really impressed by the job you did, Johnny. I mean, you had so much information. Like the listeners and viewers may have heard reference this before, but like you've got a brand new baby that you're trying to deal with taking care of, and somehow you managed to invest like so much into the research for this week. So I'm impressed.
Dude, I was literally, I had my phone on like on the couch the other day. I was freaking rocking them, and I was writing on the coffee table right there, trying to get all my notes ready.
Careful, you might be accidentally osmosising some socialist ideas into his little brain.
I told you, I felt funny. I'm changing.
Steve,
Mama, Mark.
I'm interested to hear what the questions were you had prepped first, because I don't want to gloss over the fact that you did some investment of time and thinking into the moderator.
Yeah, hold on.
Or even just a couple, you know, but I know you said we covered them, but.
Dude, I had a whole study too in 2020 that I was gonna like bring up here with strict voter IDs specifically affecting minority turnout. I never.
All right, debate's over, buddy. You're shaking the tree too hard here.
No, put it away. How do you respond to the idea that many people, regardless of race, already have IDs for daily tasks like driving or banking? That was covered. What historical systemic factors do you think connect voter ID laws to racism, et cetera, et cetera? That was already covered.
Insightful question.
Critics say these laws echo past efforts to suppress certain voters. We covered that. I got a couple out, but it just...
Yeah, Steve, I think you did a really good job coming in when you were supposed to come in.
I don't agree at all, bro.
No,
I don't agree at all. I think you guys could have done this without me.
No, I think Johnny's right about that. I'm very impressed. You guys brought a good game to the table tonight. So thank you for participating, as always, for joining us on this thing and setting it up and, you know, coming to it with some ammunition. That's really helpful. So appreciate that. Let's let that be the wrap up for the debate section, because we still need to do the roundup. And you know what? Fuck it. Maybe this is just going to be a long episode, and maybe this is really more the time frame. I mean, if we're going to be doing debates every week, like maybe we just shouldn't expect it to be an hour episode. I don't know.
I don't think there's a problem with like setting a timer and having it, but I think that if it's still continuing to go and we haven't kind of hit like a stale portion, I think it's worth continuing to explore.
Yeah, it had good feels.
There were a couple of moments during our conversation just now, Johnny, where, you know, we've made an analogy to boxing before, and I just felt like I was up against the post on the ground with you just smashing me in the face over and over again. Just like praying for.
I thought you asked really good questions, and I knew you were. I knew as soon as I started reading stuff into like poverty, I knew you were going to make a classism argument right there. And the only way I felt like I could like get out of that was to talk about like the populations, you know, being affected to a higher percent. But I felt like you did a really good job keeping me moving. I didn't expect anything less. You've always been a good debater.
I appreciate that, buddy. But candidly, some of what you came up with was tough to even grapple with, let alone rebuke. So I just was impressed.
Thanks.
I was debating whether I was going to release this one, but I have sort of an admission on our last one. You asked me if I had looked into the human rights doctrine in 1948, and I said no.
Yeah.
And that was a lie. I couldn't allow you to make the argument that it was a state granted right.
I almost am a little bit disappointed that we didn't go down that road, because I'd be very interested to hear
I know
how you would have grappled with that, but
I couldn't allow you to go down that road.
it is what it is. But
I'm sorry.
For good or bad, I feel like that was also a really productive conversation. So
it was good.
Yeah. So speaking of productive conversations that we've had in the past, we're gonna do a little bit of a revisitation of a couple of things that we talked about last round. But shall we, guys, pick debate topic and roll? Does that sound about good?
Yeah, right now?
Yes, sir.
Right, so I'm gonna screen share. Now, Steve, I resent the Spudomatic link to your email. You should have gotten it, or to the text.
I have it in text. Yeah.
Okay, so let's hold off on doing that for a moment. But I'm gonna pop up the spinning wheel so that we can pick the next round's topic.
All right. We're gonna find out if this thing is really rigged.
Not yet, when the Spudomatic comes up. But remember, if we land on dealer's choice, you, Steve, as this week's moderator, get to determine what our topic will be and what the roles will be.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So sorry to the listening audience. I'm just trying to pull it up now. Oh my God, where the hell did it go? Oh, here it is.
And Benny, real quick, we're spinning the Spudomatic on our phones. We're not doing it on
Correct. Yeah. So all you'll do is click the link to go to the Spudomatic drawer. And
okay.
Can you guys see the spinning wheel?
I can.
I can.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and click the spin button, and then Steve, once it lands on its topic, I'm going to have you read it out to the audience.
Have at it.
The wheel is spinning.
And the topic is...
Interesting.
State an existential threat to democracy.
Oh, God.
This is talking about the insurrection on January 6th.
Don't be laughing.
Yes. The darkest day in the history of America, as some have called it. This is man, I feel like we're just hitting some crazy ones. So this one I think is going to be very interesting. It's not as concrete, right? I think there's a little bit more abstract to this. So be very interested to see who gets the role to do each position. So that'll be interesting. Gentlemen, shall we? We'll do our Spudomatic and then see what the die is cast for.
Let me know when.
All right, I'm going to count it off in 3, 2, 1. Everybody done?
No.
It's backward.
God.
So I'll be the moderator for this one. Steve will be representing the right-hand side of the aisle. Johnny will be the progressive. Trying. And I think, Steve, you better watch yourself, because Johnny's got some big guns. So he's going to be trying to convince us that J6 was an existential threat to democracy.
Oh, I'm going to have all kinds of memes.
Great. You didn't know you were going to do this, but that's an incredible segue, Steve, because I was telling Johnny that over the weekend, Kristen's very good friend came to visit, stayed over on Saturday night. And so the girls knocked off early, and I was working on editing our last round for Healthcare as a Human Right. And there's a lot of waiting, because once you've done all the edits, which is its own time suck, you've got to export it, which cements it into a single file, then download it, and then re-upload it, and then post it to wherever you're doing. So long story short, I was sitting in front of my computer, drinking a ton of beer and whiskey. And I went into Meme Generator, and I started just cranking out some memes. So you can see the first one, which is not that interesting, but it is a post. It's on our Instagram of Straw and Steel. And I wanted to show you guys something that's going to call back to a topic. I was really surprised, Steve, when you brought up the country of Mongolia last round. you just kind of broke out and said, "Hey, I just realized Mongolia is still a country." How the hell did that come about?
Oh, you guys really want?
Yes, I do.
It's too early for me to get into it specifically, but suffice it to say, I'm doing a lot of research on other countries.
Okay, that's
For personal gain?
extraordinarily non. Yeah,
Yeah.
was it? Was that Johnny?
I said for personal gain.
I see.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yes, I was just curious, and I made some kind of offhand remark that to use the term mongoloid is an insult to people who are sufferers of Down syndrome. But in reality, that's just because. Are you guys familiar with Thomas Sowell?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. That was really more just for the audience to understand that you guys are well educated. I was listening. I like
those things aren't necessarily correlated.
Okay, fair enough. Educated in Chicago economics, I guess is what we'll say. But I was listening to, oh my God, what's the name of the book?
Is it
Disparity
a white liberal or black redneck or something like that?
That's one of them. I was listening to one of his more like economic based treatises, and the title of it is Discrimination and Disparities. And the reason I wanted to say the title is because it's a very interesting read. But some of what he does is he draws analogies between, for example, geographic features that exist on planet Earth that basically, if you look at it through one lens, it could be said to be, it could be analogous to the way that we draw framing around racism, for example. So one of the things he says is that Europeans excelled and became highly developed because they had ready access to running waterways that were near coastal outlets, right? And so trade could be created, large cities could develop in these places, whereas especially in places like Africa, especially like inner Africa, there's none of that. It's very difficult to eke out a living and to create a foundational society that can then develop into something very sophisticated. And so even something as simple as the geographic location where a specific people originates can lead to what today, 3,000 years later, looks like racism, for example. And the reason I brought that up is because, Steve, you called back to Mongolia. And so one thing that's fascinating about the Mongolians is that they were one of the most dominating cultures on the face of the planet for a very not insignificant amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if this is really going to add any value to this conversation, but I just wanted to share this meme and see what you guys thought about it. Can you guys see that at all?
Yeah.
So the first step of Mongolian civilization was to domesticate horses on the Mongolian steppe, and then they engineered the compound bow, which allowed them to be devastating with projectiles from horseback. Then they conquered most of ancient China. And then, of course, they learned how to get lit off fermented horse milk, which is like the galaxy brain version of Mongolia. So I just wanted to revisit this because I thought that was like a really interesting little sort of side trail that we took in our conversation. So with that being said, probably the only other thing that I wanted to talk about was your heat map, Steve, that you had brought up. So we spent a little bit of time last round reviewing the heat map, the empathy heat map. And so it was on another podcast that I was listening to that made reference to it. And I'll go ahead and name the name because I have sort of a love-hate relationship with this podcast right now, but it's called Breaking Points. And twice a week they do a secondary segment called Counterpoints. And the idea is that there's a commentator or anchor that's on the progressive side, and then there's a commentator or anchor on the conservative side, and they have a conversation, cover news stories, and it's actually a lot of times pretty informative.
Is that Kellyanne Conway?
That is not a Kellyanne Conway venture.
All right.
They've got a rotating series of 4 anchors, but anyway, I would recommend it if anybody's interested in it. It's got a similar feeling to what we're trying to do here, where we're representing 2 different opinions about the same topic. But the only point I was going to make is that they were talking about the empathy heat map having made its rounds on Reddit. And so I went back and I looked a little closer, and I did end up finding the link that you had shared with us and posting it on our previously released round. That was actually a study that was published in the journal Nature. So that was like a legit, like sort of a serious academic endeavor that led to that article and that empathy heat map you were referencing.
You seem surprised. I don't.
Part of it is because it came from you and Reddit, so there's that. But the other thing that surprised me is because they were talking about it sort of dismissively as if it was like an online, like alt-right talking point, but it was actually a serious academic pursuit that generated that. So all of that is to say, if there's any trolls that are just like a bunch of shit lefties who are going to call us out for referring to the empathy heat map, it's actual science, buddy. It comes from academia.
I got plenty of cannon fodder for that.
Bring it on. We want all of it.
I know.
Oh, sure. Okay, so just in this past week, I'm seeing like, excuse me while I get position for this one because it's very important. See, particularly in news cycles, I see a lot of people complaining about the price of eggs. Like, oh, why is the price of eggs still so high? You said you were going to elect Donald Trump to bring down the price of eggs. And like these people are so communist that they thought that controlling the price of eggs meant price controls. You know, I mean, these people just can't be broken out of their psyche. It doesn't mean price controls. And anyway, I'm not voting for the price of eggs. Guess what, bitch? I would pay $100 an egg to get gay race communism out of schools. All right? I'd pay $100 an egg to break the government into 10,000 pieces. You're getting... This is what I voted for. I lied to you about the price of eggs. Sorry, I lied.
Siri, you know what to do.
I mean, not for nothing, people who say things like that probably do believe that Donald Trump is responsible for the avian flu that's causing egg prices to be elevated right now. So, I mean, I'm not sure what to even say about that. But
no, but the point is I lied about it. I don't care about the price of eggs.
Yeah, fair enough.
I care about gay race communism, getting out of my school. That's what I care about. I care about breaking the government up. That's what I care about. And I'm getting exactly what I voted for.
Yeah.
Not mutually exclusive.
Incredible.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it could be column A and column B, I say.
Yeah, no, it's column B for me.
Oh, okay. Steve?
That's
Johnny, I know a guy who wants to buy eggs for 100 per, okay? So go after
it. If that's what it costs to get gay race communism out of schools, I'm all for it.
They're still barren from their last molt.
Your chickens do make delicious eggs. 100 might be a steep ask for even those, though. So they're not producing right now. Is that what you just said?
A couple of them are like here and there, but nothing crazy. I think this will probably be the last year these girls will probably lay. I mean, they're 5 going on 6. That's usually the life cycle of a laying hen right there as far as production, and then they'll probably live another 2 to 3 years after that.
And then what?
Get new chickens. And
what do you do with the old ones?
Well, they go on Social Security, and then they live a quiet retirement.
They live a good life. They they retire, and then they sunset the rest of their days there. No, I'm more interested in doing the fermented horse milk rather than the eggs right there. I think if I get fermented horse milk and sell it for $100 a pint or a quart or something like that, I think that might be the ticket.
I do think you have a Mongolian spirit, Johnny, so I will say that about you.
I don't know about that, but we are going to get goats this year, so if we can't do horse milk, we'll do goat milk.
Gnarly. That sounds disgusting, but I'll drink some.
It is.
Next time you fly up from Florida, Steve, we'll have to get together and talk politics at Johnny's and just like choke down chunky goat milk.
Did you guys ever see the movie Beer Fest?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Remember the part where they're trying to drink the yak piss and they're like just trying to choke it down? That's exactly what I think in my head. Trying to drink down freaking fermented goat milk.
Oh, man, that's got to be a different kind of high. All right, I think that we've covered chickens, Mongolia. What was it, Steve? What was it that's in schools, just so our listening audience?
Gay race politics.
Yeah, gay race communism, yeah.
Gay race communism. Thank you. Okay, so we did the spectrum in a very short amount of time just now, but we covered a lot. So did either of you guys have anything you wanted to go out on? Otherwise, I think we can adjourn.
I'm good.
Yeah, I flushed it out. Yeah, we're good.
All right, in that case, let's say goodbye, starting with you, man in the middle.
Thought you were supposed to go first.
I'm last.
Yeah, you're the man in the middle right now.
It was Ben, John, Steve. Johnny, signing off.
Steve, I'm out.
My name is Ben Tomzak. I'm really terrible at explaining name orders for outros and intros, but we'll see you guys next time on our next round. Bye-bye, everyone.